While our guests are coming forward, I want to just say, first and foremost, a word of welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much for being a part of our parish family. This year marks the first year of our focus and implementation of the work that we're doing in the Transforming Hearts campaign. And we hope in about a month or so to be able to give you a very solid update on where we stand. But as we lean into this year, I want to just focus you on what our priorities are as a congregation, which will be our priorities for the years to come, that ties directly into our conversation today. First, our priority as a church is to cultivate faith in an uncertain world. Second, to create new and improved spaces for connection. Third, establishing a new center for well-being. And fourth, strengthening our outreach efforts. Cultivating faith in an uncertain world. You see here, we recognize the importance of equipping our members of all ages with new approaches to spiritual growth by providing enhanced worship and music, innovative education experiences. We aim to help individuals deepen their relationship with God and navigate the challenges they face in their lives. Number two, create new and improved spaces for connection. In this time of increased isolation and loneliness, fostering connections within our church family is of utmost importance. We plan to build a state-of-the-art building and renovate existing spaces to encourage fellowship, interaction, and a sense of belonging, enabling us to support and care for one another more effectively. This will include a dedicated youth center that is welcoming and designed with their needs in mind. Number three, establish a new center for well-being. We understand the profound pastoral needs of our congregation and the importance of addressing them effectively. Our vision includes renovating existing spaces that will serve as a dedicated center for well-being education, short-term counseling, support groups, and other resources to promote the spiritual, emotional, and mental well-being within our community. And then to our conversation today, strengthening our outreach efforts. As the world experiences growing inequality, we feel called to expand our outreach efforts to the wider community. By amplifying our impact, we can extend a helping hand to those in need, advocate for opportunity, and be a beacon of hope in these challenging times. So, please know that we will be talking with you about each of these priorities this year and in the years to come. We want to thank you for being a part of this process. We want to thank you for your support, and we encourage you, both in particular now, to think about your annual pledge that allows the work that we do to be possible on an annual basis. It's vitally important so that we can do the extraordinary things that we long to do and that the world needs. Over to you.
Thank you, Chip. And good morning. It's great to have all of you here today. Chip just spoke about our priorities for this year, and today's conversation fits into at least two of those. Cultivating faith in an uncertain world, and imagine if we feel our world is uncertain, how much that's magnified in the life of people who are experiencing homelessness. And then secondly, strengthening our outreach efforts. And we've been partners for a long, long time with Roof Above, and we'll hear more about that in a second. Because today we are leaning into the changing face of homelessness. Wouldn't it be wonderful if not to imagine, but in reality, to live in a county or a state or a country in a world where nobody has to sleep rough, where nobody has to sleep outside if they don't want to? Welcome to this conversation. I'm Joan Killian, one of the clergy here. Most of you I know pretty well, but it's great to see you here. With me is our Director of Outreach and Mission, Laura Conitzer, and our special guest today is this rock star sitting over here. Liz Clasen-Kelly is the CEO of Roof Above, and she is renowned not just regionally, but across the country, for her expertise, her wisdom, her authenticity, her candor, her passion, and her hope. Welcome, Liz. We're glad you're here. So, to start the conversation off, this is probably too many questions at one time, but who is experiencing homelessness now as opposed to maybe 5 or 10 years ago?
Yeah, well, let me just start and say it is always a joy to be with this congregation. I've gotten to already see several people. I just want to honor Rachel Johnson is in the audience, and she was the very first volunteer coordinator at what was Urban Ministry Center. And when I was 19 years old and I did an internship that would change my life, Rachel Johnson was my supervisor. She was Catholic at the time, so I wasn't expecting to see her here. But I know Christ Church is a welcoming congregation for many different people. I love the notion of faith in uncertain times. So there's many people I love, but I wanted to honor that. And it's funny to think back to when I was 19 and who we were serving at that time, and to think about what homelessness looks like today. And so one thing, there's like the lens of, since the mid-70s when homelessness as we know it really started. And then there's the lens of, in the last 5 to 10 years, kind of what's been changing. So what many people don't know is that in 2008, when we had the recession, poverty went up, but homelessness went down. And in the last few years, we've seen, so the number one change, I would say, we've seen homelessness start to rise again.
Right.
And I've prepared some slides in my nerdy way that could talk about some changes we've seen in homelessness. So if you want me to kind of talk through those, I can kind of root us all in the data of homelessness. And so this slide, you guys have screens somewhere where you can see? Okay, thank you. I was like, how are they going to see those? There's two ways we measure homelessness as a community primarily. One is the point-in-time count. Raise your hand if you've ever volunteered with the point-in-time count. Anyone in here?
A few hands.
So this is one night when we mobilize and go out into camps and on the streets and try to count people experiencing unsheltered homelessness.
It was about a week ago.
It happened, a week and a half ago. So, and our tagline was "Imagine a county where no one is homeless." So, great plug there. The other way is our county has a database, and when people come in and get connected with services, their information is captured, and so every month they look at kind of what's the count of homelessness. And this is a graph of looking at how that number of people experiencing homelessness that have come in for services has changed since 2020. And so around about 3,000 people are experiencing homelessness. And we can take that 3,000 and break it down, if you go to the next slide, of who that is. And so about a third of that 3,000 people are people and families. It represents about 300 families, and that's one of the ways homelessness has been changing, as we've seen family homelessness grow. About 2/3 of the folks are individuals. The largest group, this has been true since homelessness as we know it started, the largest group tends to be single men, is the largest population experiencing homelessness. We'll talk a little bit more about the age of those single individuals, how that's been changing as well. So we've seen an increase in the aging of homelessness, but we've also seen an increase in young people. So we've had, this number has about 164 people who are between 18 to 24. So we're seeing that number sadly increase. We've always had a significant crossover between veterans and people experiencing homelessness. This number is actually down. We've made tremendous investments as a nation, but there's still right now, we think about 250 veterans who've served time in the military who are also experiencing homelessness. And then about 600 people are this category that roof above. I gotta recognize Kathy Izzard in the room. We've had a lot of work together on, which is ending chronic homelessness. And in some ways we've made a lot of progress, and in other ways that number persists. When Kathy and I started out, Kathy led something called, what do we call it? The vulnerability, now I forgot the name of it, but it was an amazing point in time count, just even amped up over a week of time to identify everyone experiencing chronic homelessness, and that number we found was 807. So we've made some progress, but that number's been as low as in the 200s, so to see us back at 600 is a bit distressing. So that's kind of who's experiencing homelessness today. And I got more slides if you want me to keep going, but
We would
feel
love
free
that.
to. Okay.
Well, you mentioned age, and I just
Yeah.
happened to hear a blurb on public radio the other day talking about that. And I think, I'm not sure I have the years right, but maybe in the last 20 years or so, the average age of a person experiencing homelessness has gone up 20 years. It was like 30, and now it's 50.
So interesting that kind of every year we see the average age go up.
Wow.
And kind of the theory behind that is there were things that happened in the 80s that were big economic drivers in people's lives, and we've seen that create vulnerability, and so kind of there's a cohort of people that continues to be vulnerable to homelessness.
Interesting.
So some recent Department of Health and Human Services report came out recently that said older adults are the single fastest growing group of people experiencing homelessness. These charts are from our Roof Above data. You can see that line. So we've essentially had people, and I hesitate to say 55 and older as a woman approaching 50. I don't like to think of 55 and older as old, but the realities of the science is if you've experienced homelessness, by the age of 55, you're seeing some health concerns that you would expect to see from people who are 65. So we know homelessness ages people faster. So we've seen people 55 and up, that number nearly triple over just the last few years in terms of who's coming to Roof Above services. And that chart has people in their 90s. So not this past Christmas Eve, but the Christmas Eve before that, we had someone 91 come into our shelter that we'd never seen before. And part of that is just families and generational poverty and people not being able to care for their elders like they would want to.
Right. Wow.
When you think about the obstacles, what do you see as the biggest obstacles in reducing or even eliminating homelessness in Charlotte and really nationally?
Yeah. So it's interesting. You can look at that question on an individual level or on a system level. So, and you've probably seen this. Do we have room in the inn volunteers in the room? Thank you. Or what about meal volunteers at the shelter? So thank you. Christ Church is involved in our work in a lot of ways. So if you come into our doors, you're seeing folks struggling with significant physical health issues. We're seeing folks struggling with significant mental health issues. We've seen that exacerbated since the pandemic. You're seeing folks who are underemployed, struggling with maybe familial challenges. And so that's often when we think about homelessness, we talk about those things. But if you zone out and look at the community level, there are two drivers of homelessness that they found. So one is that they found, well, you guys in the audience tell me, what are the cities that you associate with homelessness? When you think about large numbers of homelessness, what cities do you guys think of? Los Angeles, San Francisco,
New York,
Portland, Seattle. These are growing, prospering, thriving cities. So they found that the number two best predictors of homelessness in a community are how expensive is your housing and how tight is your rental market. So if you have really low vacancy rates for apartments, then you tend to have higher homelessness. And so at the system level, it's really prosperities associated with homelessness. At the individual level, everyone we're serving is poor, but Detroit has one of, the state of Alabama is the single state with the lowest homelessness rate in America, right? So it's a little counterintuitive. So the image that people are using today is the image of musical chairs. So, if you're playing a musical chair, every round a chair gets taken away. And so, I never win at musical chairs because I'm not an athlete, right? So people who are slower, if you've got a broken leg, you're probably going to lose out on musical chairs. But the reason you're losing out is not because you have a broken leg or you're not athletic. It's because someone keeps taking the chairs away, right? That's why people are falling. And so the reason we have homelessness is because we don't have sufficient housing supply for the ways our communities are growing. So I think it's important to look at things from a community and system level as well as the individual level. So we know we're not growing our housing supply to keep up with the need, and the people who are losing out then on housing are the poorest and most vulnerable people. So we've got to be addressing that both at a system level and at an individual level.
So how is, if the face of homelessness is changing, the demographics or the dynamics of it, how is Roof Above evolving to meet those challenges and changes?
So I think, so we merged, for those who don't know, if you're like, I've not heard of Roof Above, Christ Church has been involved for a long time. So Roof Above was born from the merger of Men's Shelter of Charlotte and Urban Ministry, where Christ Church has had a relationship with both nonprofits for a long time. And when we merged, we really became this continuum. So we're meeting people's basic needs, but we're also building housing. So when I think about how are we evolving, we're really trying to do it in a balanced way. So we know right now, according to the last point in time count from 2023, there were about 300 people sleeping outside, right? And we don't ever, if anyone wants to come in, we want to make sure we have space, but the reality is our shelter system is full now. So we've been thinking about how to grow shelter, and so we've added a third shelter, and some of that was allowed, with helpful to do with pandemic funding, but we also are really focused on what are the exit ramps from homelessness, and what are the different types of people who need different exit ramps, and so we've been developing different housing programs, and we've been doing those largely. Christ Church was a big part of helping us build More Place, which was incredible. And we bought land and we built a beautiful new building. And that made a lot of sense at the time. But right now, with what's happening in Charlotte and land prices and construction prices, buying land and building new is cost prohibitive. So we've been spending a lot of time saying, what exists already that we can reimagine as a solution to homelessness? And I've got a couple slides, if I could just tell you about some of the things we've been doing. And you guys were part of this. I'll keep saying that, but you guys really are such a critical part. Hotels. And so, 2020, the pandemic came. Essentially, anyone doing homeless services did things in crowded ways because we were always trying to stretch ourselves more and more. And then come March 2020, you realize, oh my gosh, the whole way we've been serving people might literally kill people. And so we had to quickly figure out how to do things in a socially distanced way. So we started partnering with motels to offer emergency shelter. And we toured one of those hotels that was operating at like 18% occupancy. It's right off Clanton Road. And we thought, oh my gosh, could be shelter, but this really could become apartments. And so we did our first hotel conversion. So if you drive on 77 and around exit 7, take a look for that mural. So that marks the Rise on Clanton, SECU, the Rise on Clanton. So you guys were part of making that transition happen. And so that we bought it in November of 2020, operated as a shelter with the Salvation Army to serve women and families because we couldn't do room in the inn, and that's such a critical population we serve during the wintertime. And so we ran it as shelter, and then we added kitchens to all the rooms and added a support services wing, and it became a replication of More Place. So it's 88 apartments. If you want a tour, we'll tour you. It's really beautiful and gave us a lot of hope and promise for hotels as an affordable housing solution. And the county said, hey, we like this idea. The county's an investor in that project as well. So they took ARPA funds and actually said, hey, we'll buy the hotel, we'll renovate the hotel. So that picture beside it, you probably haven't visited that. That's an old in-town suites off of exit 3, the Airwood exit at 77. So it's a very random place with like Sonic and Starbucks and a Marriott, and it's a random collection of buildings. And this is kind of off of Airwood, so it's wooded. There's this gorgeous courtyard. So right now it's very small. We have 25 people in it while some renovations are going on. So that is all county-led, paid for, but they are asking us to operate it. So generally our projects take a long time to do because we have to raise the funds, but if the county pays 100%, we are up and running very quickly. And so that will focus on people who are 55 and older. So recognizing this trend of aging and homelessness, they said, let's create some specialized housing for an older population. So that's hotels. We're also doing apartments, and I'll in a little bit just do some shout out with some amazing apartment preservation work that members of this congregation have been critical in. But this is Hill Rock Estates. If you know where Aldersgate community is, Hill Rock Estates is just adjacent to it. So this is a 341-unit apartment community that an investor had bought and was flipping apartments and adding like really nice appliances and redid the the like main office to add a movie theater. There's a baby grand piano. There's a swimming pool. Lots of things you don't associate with roof above, like we now own a baby grand piano thanks to we bought Hill Rock Estates. So this apartment, as the landlord was making these apartments nicer, they were changing, rents were like $800 and they were moving them to $1,200. And we see this happening across our community, which is really driving housing costs and therefore driving housing insecurity and then homelessness. And so we said, we can come in and buy this. We're going to hold rents flat, and then we'll take 75 units to serve folks who are chronically homeless. We'll drop rents to about $250 that people who are on disability income can afford. And then on site, we have a nurse and case managers to support those 75 units. So this is essentially a version of More Place, just embedded in a larger apartment community. And so we love it because not only is it creating a solution for chronic homelessness, but it's preserving that affordable housing for all the others. And so then our last reimagination, which is not yet, well, it kind of was, you guys, some in the room might know this, in the pandemic, we leased the former dormitories of King's College. And in fact, this was like in the height of the pandemic, and your youth group came and painted this wall, because I toured with Kathy Izzard, and there was this bright red wall. I was like, I think that's fine. And Kathy said, no, everyone will be angry who walks in the lobby. This like red wall is not going to stand. She said, don't worry, I've got the volunteers. And so in mask, which was good because paint fumes, but also good because of COVID, your youth group came and just upfitted just to make the lobby a bit more beautiful and other things. So this had last been in operation in December of 2018, so it had been vacant. So actually some of your church members helped with some funding to upfit it. So we spent a little bit of money to get the rooms going again, and we ran that for a year and a half as a shelter for working men during the pandemic. Phenomenal success. 70% of our men who came in to that program left out in housing. And again, this is in the height of the pandemic. And our staff said, well, Liz, we want to just keep running this. And I said, do you see this plumbing that's overflowing? Like, this building is on its last leg, and we don't have any more COVID funds to operate it. And they said, no, Liz, there's something really special about this place. And part of it was that guys love having their own rooms, but part of it is it's literally beside Independence Park. The birds are amazing. It's walking distance to Transit Center. There's just so much about this location that was working for men's lives. And so an amazing donor helped us purchase this, and we are now in the ends of raising money to renovate it. It has had a long life, and so the renovation is going to essentially take it down to the studs and redo mechanical and plumbing and electrical, but we're very excited to hopefully bring this online in the next year and a half once we finish fundraising. And this will be for men who are focused on workforce development. So when I talk about different exit ramps, we need a place for folks who are in recovery, for folks who are trying to, catapult their life forward. I got an email this morning. One of our guests in the shelter, they want to provide him custody of his child. And it's like, we've got to get an exit ramp for men like that who are working and almost have it together but need a little bit. And we also have an exit ramp for, the woman who's outside struggling with schizophrenia and has been living outside for 4 years. So we're focused on how do we reimagine spaces in our community for different types of housing for different people.
For a spectrum.
Yes.
Yeah.
That was a lengthy answer. So thank you
No,
all
it's
for sticking
wonderful.
with me.
Well, no, two comments on there. One quick one. I love the idea that they're next to parks and they have a baby grand piano and all of these, because I think sometimes we might have the mindset of, well, we just need the basics. These are people who are used to living outside, so just the basics. We don't need to have beauty and experience the joy of what we experience in life. They just need to get by. And they're not just getting by in these places. They are places of beauty with murals and a pool and all of that sort of thing. The other thing I hear in what you were saying is, and some people don't like the term Band-Aids, and I appreciate that, but we're not we're not just putting Band-Aids. Band-Aids are important.
They are.
You know, we need shelters. We need emergency shelters and shelters where people have a roof over their head for the night. But with this spectrum approach, you're moving into much more of a systemic change to what housing can look like for a wide variety of people in their situations.
Absolutely. It was interesting. I pulled some national data, and New York City is a right to shelter city. And so they have to invest in emergency shelter. So New York City has the lowest percentage of people unsheltered of any major US city. Only 4% of people experiencing homelessness in New York are sleeping outside. New York also has the single largest population of people experiencing homelessness, right? Because if you invest everything you need in shelter and not housing, people get stuck. But if you just invest in housing and you're not increasing your shelter system to meet your growing city, then you end up with people sleeping outside. And I think what we've seen when you go to Portland, when you go to Los Angeles, almost 75% of people experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles are sleeping outside. Wow. And that's not only incredibly challenging for their life, but then it creates a slew of issues that we're seeing now in Charlotte, some conversations that our council will take on in the coming weeks. But when people are sleeping outside, it creates challenges for the business community, it creates public health challenges. So we really have to have this balanced approach of how are we increasing our basic needs to keep up with the demands, but also what are those solutions? And all that, of course, costs money, right? Which is, I think sometimes we want the solutions to be easier than they are, but when we invest, when we invest in people, we never lose out. That's like a faith belief of mine, but I really do believe when we don't lose sight of each other's humanity, that's when we are at our best.
One of the things I say over and over to myself and sometimes out loud is we all do better when we all do better. Yeah. We really do.
Well, Liz, we are so fortunate in Charlotte to have wonderful organizations working on the housing crisis. And I wonder how you all are working and collaborating together. Many of the organizations we partner with here at Christ Church, but I'm wondering how you all are collaborating to address some of these issues and the changing landscape.
So I think sometimes there's this notion that we're siloed, and I think, one, there's a lot of personal connectivity between organizations and just, depending on each other and learning from each other. I also think we've tried to be thoughtful about what are each other's lanes, and it's okay to have different lanes. Like Charlotte Family Housing, I know, is like near and dear to you guys, and they're doing great work with families, phenomenal outcomes. And it's just a different program than what Roof Above is trying to do. And Salvation Army Center of Hope is focused on families, where we're focused on individuals. So I think we've tried to be thoughtful around what are each other's lanes and giving each other space to be in those lanes. Then there's we have integrated staffing models, right? And so there are organizations there's a Salvation Army case manager who helps do case management for one of our programs, the way we kind of leverage each other and work in partnership. I think the big thing that's happened in our community over it's taken some years now, is the Home for All plan. So it kind of started pandemic, and it was really saying, how do we connect the housing crisis with the homelessness crisis and understand that and create solutions that understand how those two things are related? So the plan came out, then it took lots more months, and then an implementation plan came out. So now there's the Home for All implementation plan, which it just got an update just in the last few weeks because that initial plan was really focused around some prevention efforts. And people were saying, but right now there's people sleeping uptown, and what are we doing with this crisis? So that plan kind of amended. And so I think that is when we share a common vision. I love the scripture, without vision, people perish, right? And so I think that's really trying to say, what's our common vision for where we can head? And where can we all find ourselves in that, so we have some level of coordination, but that we can do different things and have different strengths, but we're all headed to the same destination. So I'm really proud. I know people say, well, you're so siloed, or we have too many nonprofits. But I'm incredibly proud for how we, I think, do work to check ego and find ways to come together. I think most of the nonprofits have really shared vision for where we want to go and how we can get there together.
You've used a word a couple of times I think it's important to talk about for a moment, and that's workforce, as in workforce development. I Googled the other day to see what the median salary is for a CMS teacher, and it's $56,900. Imagine trying to live on $57,000 in Charlotte with housing. And I think when we think about people experiencing homelessness or really having life-changing issues because of affordability, and we tend to not think of, we may think of the stereotype of the person living rough on the street, and not the fact that there are people working full-time jobs, sometimes 2 or 3 jobs, and having to live on the outskirts of Charlotte because that's the only place that they can afford to live.
Yeah, I think if you can cue up the slide, there's a slide with like 4 colorful lines. And I think this is actually one of the scariest pieces of data that's out there, because this tells us what's coming. So this is a slide of what's called cost burdened. So you're cost burdened if you're paying more than 30% of your income on housing. And that top pink line is if you're making less than $20,000 a year. And it's almost everyone. So if you're making $20,000 a year, there's essentially not housing you can afford. The line beside it is pretty much in the same place, and that's between $20,000 to $35,000. So that's been a change. That's I think that they're like 92, 93%, can't see it from here. But what's really disturbing are the yellow and blue lines. And so that blue line is you're making between $50,000 and $75,000 a year. And that's not that many years that we've seen that. So now almost half of the households making less than $75,000 a year are cost burdened. What that means is you become more housing insecure.
Right.
So your ability to, someone has, you get COVID and you're in a job without COVID leave. You have some sort of, your parent passes away and you're, spending money on funeral arrangements. Some economic blip in your life, you suddenly become much more vulnerable. So we might not be seeing that right now in our homeless services system, but when you see rises like that in those lines, what we know is what's coming. And so we have to be acting as a community because we really do all pay for it. When you're, I had my son was in 3rd grade. He had an awesome teacher. She had financial hardship in her life and ended up moving with her family to Pennsylvania, and she was very sad. And she was this amazing teacher, and it's like she couldn't manage the finances of our community. So my son had a change in teacher mid-year. And so I say that just to say, back to this point, right? Like the interconnectivity of households. And so as we prosper as a community, which I'm very happy to be living in a prosperous community, but how do we make sure we're all sharing in that prosperity? And that means we have to invest in some significant ways to make sure we're all continuing to do well.
Right. One of the other things you've mentioned, I don't know that you called it this, but the idea of wraparound services. So if you can define that. But one of the things that we love is when multiple partners of ours are all engaged with one another and or in the same sorts of services. And so Charlotte Family Housing does it. And some other ideas are Housing Impact Fund is looking at doing that. Talk a little bit about what wraparound services are, and then also how they help people find that exit ramp from homelessness.
Yeah. So our old way of thinking in homelessness was like, while you're experiencing homelessness, we're going to give you all sorts of services. And then when we think you've got everything together, go to housing, right? And of course, that is not, one, it's when you're in homelessness, it's really hard to get everything together. So we found people getting stuck. And then people need supports to transition. And so we've really redesigned the system to say, well, yeah, we still have services when you're experiencing homelessness, but let's try to get you to housing as soon as possible. And then let's have services wrapped around there. I mean, I joke, but it's like we all need people in our life. And, I'm fortunate, and many of our are fortunate that our wraparound services comes in the form of family. But not all families have resources in that way, and not all people are able to be connected with their family. Sometimes those bridges have been burned. So we've really tried to create the system. And some people will need services for a long time. Right? Some people struggling with severe and persistent mental illness or very significant health challenges, those services might need to be permanent. Other people need it just for 3 months, a year, 2 years to help in that transition. But I think it's important that that's not something needed just for people in a housing crisis. It's like we all need people who have our back. We all need teachers in our lives. There's just way more that we have in common than we have different.
I think there's been more than one song written about that, people who need people. But yes, very much. Can you give some examples of what those wraparound services look like or consist of? What kind of services are people partaking of?
Yeah. So I think the most general one is case management, and that can mean a lot of different things. So generally that means someone to walk with you, generally on goals that you're setting in your life. So that can mean helping connect you to, physical health care, helping you learn to cook meals, helping you think through workforce conflict and, how do you stick through conflict or work through issues on your jobs. Because we largely in Roof Above's housing program serve folks who are very vulnerable and coming out of chronic homelessness, a nurse has been kind of a non-negotiable for us. That was true before COVID, but really post-COVID, we have seen physical health and mental health and substance use, all of those things are exacerbated, I think really from this time of disconnectedness that we had. So we always have a nurse. I know other programs focused more on working families are really looking at financial services. We partner with Commonwealth Charlotte, which does great trauma-informed financial supports in people's lives. And so I think that's a piece. And then, of course, just the workforce. We've got great partners in Goodwill and others that are helping people grow their skills and grow their income.
Cool.
We are really interested in learning more about that little fund that you might have teased a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I can't be in this church and not talk about Nelson Schwab, right? Can we just give a shout out to Nelson Schwab in this room? People sometimes will say, what are you excited about? And of course, you want to be talking about your own work in that. But the thing I think the most exciting thing happening in housing in this nation is happening here in Charlotte, and it's the Housing Impact Fund. If you don't know about it, the Housing Impact Fund, they don't use philanthropy, they use philanthropic investment. So investors who are willing to invest their money over a couple of decades, so often people investing in housing are wanting, returns of more than 20% in just a few years' time. So this is long-term investment in single-digit returns. So it's not, the huge returns you might expect from housing, but they're saying, let's go out, and while all these hedge funds are buying up apartments in Charlotte and increasing rents, let's compete with those hedge funds, and let's do it not to increase rents. We can still have modest returns simply by holding rents affordable. And in fact, they did this brilliant thing, because they're philanthropic investment and not philanthropy. They have to pay property taxes like every other for-profit business, but they went to the city and county and said, okay, we'll pay your property taxes, but how about you give those property taxes back? So for 15% of our units, we can serve folks at the lowest incomes, and so we have rents that are typically around $500. And the city and county said, we think that's brilliant, we're in. And so they have now bought, I think it's more than 1,000 apartments. They've had their second fundraise, they're going out to buy more. And this, it's this word, it's called NOAH, naturally occurring affordable housing. That's just a fancy way of saying old apartments. So old apartments typically rent lower, but old apartments in places like Charlotte that are growing are just a magnet for outside investment because they can raise those rents and have profit. That's how the economy works. So what I love about the Housing Impact Fund is they said, okay, we're going to take our market economy and figure out how it can still produce affordable housing. You know, for a long time in Charlotte, and this is still true in places like Alabama, where I'm from, in Kingsport, Tennessee, it's not the government and nonprofits providing most of the affordable housing, it's the market. It's just by having older apartments and rents tend to be lower. It's just that our growth has meant that's gone out of whack in Charlotte, and so the Housing Impact Fund is using market-based tactics to create affordable housing. So, you know, that chance to do that in New York and Seattle, that's gone, right? That NOAH is gone, but in Charlotte, we still have these NOAH properties, so the time is now to be investing and preserving them. And I can remember getting to meet with Chip and Nelson in Chip's office, and he's saying, you know, I'm thinking about what can I be doing for this community. And what a phenomenal, he and Erskine Bowles and someone named Mark Etheridge have partnered together to bring this idea to our community. It's been lauded nationally as one of the most innovative ideas out there. So I can't be here and not. I'm just a fan of it from the outside. And then this year, a local foundation was asked to be part of the fund. And they said, you know, we just do grants to nonprofits. We don't do investment, but we love this. So they gave, I've never had this happen before. I got a phone call. I didn't ask for money, but this foundation said, Liz, we'd like to give roof above $500,000 for you to then become an investor in the Housing Impact Fund. So I'm now not just a fan in the Housing Impact Fund, I'm an investor in the Housing Impact Fund, which makes me feel very cool when I get to be at the table with all of these big banks and other innovator investors. So thank you for the faith in an uncertain world that creates a member that says, hey, I'm not a spring chicken, but I want to be doing something. And what a thing that these three people together have done.
That is really cool. I think that we would like to open it up for questions. Is Deb here? Deb is going to run our microphone around for us. Hunter has the microphone for you. So if you've got questions, raise your hand, and we will come and find out.
And thank you all so much for being here.
There's a question right here. And yes, thank you for being here with Liz, and Liz for being with us.
Hi, Liz.
Hi, Deb.
You answered this question sitting in that seat maybe 10 years ago. Every day, many days of the week, we'll drive up to an intersection. There'll be somebody with a sign that says, homeless, please help. What's your advice?
Yeah.
Has that advice changed?
Yeah. Well, it's about to change because on February 12th, the city council is probably going to make it an arrestable offense to hold a sign at a median strip. So, you know, it's interesting because I'm a mom of a 10-year-old, and he's recently, my husband and I have different responses to this, and so our 10-year-old's been like sussing this out on like, now why does daddy do this and you do this? So my answer comes from doing street outreach for years. And so the thing I will say is most people experiencing homelessness will never ask for money in that way. So that's just a small subsection of people experiencing homelessness. And sometimes the people doing that no one's ever like in a great lease in a great apartment and just is out there, but sometimes people are doubled up or in other housing situations. My experience is generally, it's a very dehumanizing process to put yourself out there and ask for money. And in my personal experience, generally what's driven that is the disease of addiction. And so I think it's important to just think about that, right? And so the things I always say are, look people in the eye, acknowledge humanity. You're going to feel uncomfortable, and we should feel uncomfortable. And what that discomfort's about is we know that we have a lot of resources and the person standing next to you doesn't. And that's true there's 3,000 people experiencing homelessness right now, but we don't always see that. And so when we're at that intersection or walking uptown, someone's demanding we see that. And so we, as Roof Above, suggest not giving money, but giving a recognition of humanity, and, offering, we have like cards that people can be connected to our day services center, what was the original urban ministry center. Very few people that you hand that card to will say, oh, thanks, I didn't know. Like generally people say, oh, they won't help me and here's all the reasons why. It's a power dynamic conversation, but recognize that that person is in a time of great need. And so for me, it's like I try to recognize humanity. I say a prayer. If I'm in a place to stop and say, hey, are you connected with outreach? I just get to have that knowledge base and so can have that conversation. But we don't necessarily recommend giving money. But it's not that that person isn't in need. It's just that money isn't solving that need in that moment. Now, as a parent, that becomes a very complicated conversation to have with a 10-year-old, right? And so we just try to talk through, what are the things that we're doing as a family to try to help, even if we're not giving money to this person. I'm a donor to Roof Above. I'm a donor to YWCA and other great causes. And so we try to talk about what do we do as a family to try to end this reality in our community. I think kids are... I can remember my stepdaughter when she was younger. I was doing some early morning outreach, and she came with me, which wasn't probably the best parenting decision, but how impacted she was by seeing that. And I think we become accustomed to seeing people in crisis in a way that it's not easy for kids to process. And it's like, we need to become more like kids rather than kids becoming more like us. They're telling us something is not right in our community.
And some of you may be wondering at Christ Church ways that we have to be involved. And we actually have some very wonderful opportunities across the different, whatever your comfort level is, I guess I should say. We have been supporting Room in the Inn here for many, many years. In fact, Liz was going to park in her parking spot this morning, and she pulled up, and the Room in the Inn bus was there in her parking spot, which was kind of perfect.
Right.
Perfect. Room in the Inn requires a small army of Christ Church volunteers every Sunday night, but without that army of volunteers, we would not be able to house 14 neighbors every Sunday night in the Blue Room upstairs. We feed them, give them an opportunity for a warm bed, shower, a night's rest off the streets during the coldest months. And it does not happen without a lot of work. We, as a Room in the Inn committee, are finding it more and more difficult to find volunteers that are willing to spend the night with our guests or to pick them up in the van. So that has become an ongoing challenge for us. And I would encourage you to get uncomfortable. We talk a lot about that in outreach. What it feels like to be uncomfortable and put ourselves in someone else's shoes might help us think of our neighbors a little differently. So after this forum, our friend Paula Moss is going to be sitting out front if you want to learn more about ways to serve at Room in the Inn. Joan also mentioned a spectrum, and Christ Church Outreach for many years has supported a wide variety of housing and initiatives across the spectrum. Everything from sheltering individuals to providing transitional housing, like Charlotte Family Housing does for families, YWCA does for women, the relatives for teens, Time Out Youth for LGBTQIA youth coming out of homeless situations. We also work with Safe Alliance, and that is for women who are coming out of battered situations and abusive situations. And we work with Habitat, which it's starting next week. This week you could join us on our Habitat site and help someone achieve the goal of homeownership. So there are lots of ways to support our initiatives, we are just so happy for you to come along with us. Ask questions. There's wonderful information on our website, and I'm always willing to help you connect to what you might feel excited to get uncomfortable doing.
And I'll just say, I, in college, had the privilege of starting a room in the Insight at Davidson College, which was amazing. But my role was overnight host. And it was formational for me because there are so many good conversations, and it is uncomfortable. It is this like moment of shared experience that is, I think, a powerful spiritual experience. And sometimes people just sleep and it's quiet, and sometimes there's that person who can't sleep well, and just that, those late night conversations that, I think about like with a college roommate, and some of the best conversations are at 1 a.m. And that's how I feel about overnight hosting at Room in the Inn. So if you haven't, it makes for a tired day the next day, but I think it also makes for a very powerful experience. And so thank you all for being Room in the Inn host sites, and thank you for supporting all of those great organizations you just named. It takes all of us to be, building up this community and this kingdom together.
I think I saw another hand or two out here a moment ago. Was there more questions?
I have one.
Yeah, Joanne.
I just wanted, I was going to ask you, talk about difficult spaces. If you could speak to, and I know in your role, because people will run and say, well, Liz said, why does the Queen City have such an allergy to tiny homes? And I just wonder, and I say that from a social justice, a Jesus perspective, and I just wonder, is the allergy to tiny homes to protect those who have deep lawns? Is it to protect the needs of the haves versus the needs of the invisible?
Yeah, great question. So I think tiny homes, absolutely. One, there's different tiny homes, right? And so sometimes there's a movement that's happening in California now for what's called pallet shelters. And so they're not homes in the sense of having plumbing and kitchens. It's kind of a alternative to tents. And that's one piece. But when I think of tiny homes, I think of neighborhoods and housing. Austin's done some really interesting work with tiny homes, and you might have followed their work. So Charlotte, you'd have to ask the UDO and kind of zoning, right? So we just had this big zoning redo, and it didn't make way, as I understand it, for tiny home communities. What it does allow are for tiny homes in people's backyards and accessory dwelling units, and I think that's a great possibility. I have a couple concerns on tiny homes. So one goes a little bit to what you were saying earlier, Joan, which is if we're not embracing tiny homes for all economic spectrums, right, it becomes like, oh, people who are poor can get by with 250 square feet where we expect something different from others. But I think if we're looking at tiny homes across economic spectrums, the reality is in a place like Charlotte with land cost, we often think of tiny homes being more cost effective, but with the cost of land and land development, it's actually not necessarily more cost effective than something like a hotel conversion. But I think it's absolutely part of the spectrum. There's a great new grassroots nonprofit called Pivot Point that's looking at those kind of tiny shelters as an alternative to encampments. And then Home Again Foundation has a couple tiny homes. They've done an interesting couple parcel, and they've got, I think, 8 units, and I think a couple of them are kind of efficiency tiny home units, and they're doing interesting things with manufactured housing. So I think there's some promising practices out there. I think our zoning laws would have to change in a different way to allow for tiny home communities. And I think it would be difficult with the current land cost to make a tiny home community cost efficient. But I think it's part of the answer. So I'm not allergic to it, certainly. I am interested in how we get to the quantity that we need and what are the different ways to get there.
Thank you.
It's a great question.
I think, Ben, did you have a question? One last question?
The housing first model, you're putting
Get
a single bed in the house they're at. Tell us something about that program.
Deb, can you get the microphone to
so
him?
I think Ben was asking about housing first. And so housing first is a notion that came about really starting in New York and California in the late 80s, early 90s. And it really was kind of flipping this model of, hey, while you're experiencing homelessness, get everything together and then you like earn your way to housing. And it really, I think, fueled grace into the model and said, hey, even in your brokenness, let's connect you with housing and surround you with supports. And it really started with particularly focused on folks who were experiencing chronic homelessness, so folks who'd persisted in homelessness for a year or longer and had a disabling condition. But that notion has been applied now across the board and kind of changed our system to say, let's move folks into housing as quickly as possible. When they've done some interesting research into housing first, what they found is that people have as good of outcomes, so even when you're not requiring sobriety or not requiring compliance to mental health medication, there's similar outcomes, even without requiring it. And then what they found is tremendous housing stability. So when you have very low barriers to get into housing, I think there's the thought that, oh, no one's ever going to be able to maintain housing. And we've been able to maintain an 85% and higher housing retention rate using Housing First. So Housing First was kind of lauded across the political aisles, and there's a lot of unity around that, and I still find that in Charlotte. When you listen on the West Coast, as unsheltered homelessness has grown, there's been a lot more tension around the question of housing first. And so the reality is the type of housing that we do at Moore Place is the most expensive housing because it's permanent, long-term supports, and typically serving people who maybe at most could pay $250, $300 a month afford that. And so I think it's important that we're finding more cost-effective exit ramps, but there just is a population that we need to invest in. And the reality is if we don't invest, we look at things like hospital bills and 911 phone calls and the impacts on downtown businesses when people are on the street, and we find that there's a cost-effective nature. Even though it's expensive to do housing first, it's actually not that expensive when you consider all the other costs in a community. Yeah, so the Housing First that we operate, it's all permanent supportive housing, and that permanent doesn't mean it has to be lifelong, it just means it's not time limited. And so we've seen people, like we've had someone move out and become a homeowner, and we have people fall in love and get married, and we have people that reconnect with family and want to age in place with family. So we've got different people that leave, and we have people who really probably will need that long-term affordability and long-term supports. So thank you.
Liz, excuse me, thank you so much for being here today. When I think about our conversation, I'm reminded of Jesus when he talks about the birds of the air have nests and foxes have dens, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. And I have to think that that means that Jesus has a special place in his heart and in his mission for those who are experiencing homelessness. He knows something of it. And if we are to be imitators of Christ, then we need to do the same thing and be that. So thank you for such a rich conversation today and for being here with us and for all that you do.
It is an honor to be here. Thank you guys so much for your support. I will say, I do this work because I get to see God every day at work. And when I was 19 and had that internship with Rachel Johnson, I felt a sense of life, which is, and I still feel that way. So God is busy on our campuses, as I know God is busy here. So thank you for the work we get to do together.
Thank you. Thank you so much.